The God of Jane by Jane Roberts, Chapter 24. And this is the conclusion of the book. The month of October has always been exciting and magical to me. Orange leaves falling everywhere, piled in gutters, flying across lawns, flapping against window panes like orange birds peeking into living rooms. In the October of 1979, I heard about another psychic fair. This one was coming to town, and I hoped that it would fare better than the one I'd read about earlier. The coming event struck me as peculiarly American in character, even though gypsies had traveled all through Europe for centuries, telling fortunes and reading tarot cards. The gypsies, though, were often mischievous, and the people who were to conduct the fair were more or less ordinary people from all walks of life, whose distinguishing gift was psychic. In rather typical American fashion, I thought, they were taking their wares to the marketplace, displaying their psychic products out in the open, forsaking the old seance rooms and spooky cubbyholes for the bright malls at noon. Yet, I thought, there were some neat, spooky implications. I imagined consumers, arms filled with packages, pausing at the rows of card tables set up outside the shops. People knew what to expect when buying coats, apples, beer, or souvenirs. Those products have recognizable purposes. But, as the newspaper ads explained, the psychics hoped to show the powers of the mind at work. They hoped to display psychological products that were as real as any physical wares. The term fortune-telling was never used in the advertisements, but the word parapsychology was, predominantly as if this implied a relationship with science that made the entire fair more respectable and worthy. In any case, the fair was almost canceled. I could hardly believe it when a group of local religious fundamentalists began an impassioned campaign to intimidate the merchants at the mall. Nice American housewives met in spotless spick-and-span kitchens to drink coffee and dial the telephone until all the businessmen at the shopping centers were contacted. Those good, upright ladies warned that the psychic's information came from the devil, that Satan was behind the psychic fair. As good, proper Christians, their obligation was clear. They would boycott the entire mall if the fair were held. Now, that was good American ingenuity at work, I thought. Hit the pocketbook, but I was very uneasy. I hadn't expected that kind of bitterness in Elmira, or realized that fundamentalism's peculiar blend of fanaticism had reached into this comparatively small town. Was it crisscrossing the country? Was it taking advantage of October's great natural exhilaration, riding it to the hilt, using nature's excitement to emphasize the prejudice of an ancient god? You can bet your booties it was, I thought. The fair was held in a central spot, rented out by the mall to any community or business or professional group who had the cash. But as people lined up at the psychic tables, they were handed pamphlets proclaiming that the psychic readings were satanic, inspired by the devil to deceive people and to steal souls away from God. Shortly afterward, another religious group took over a local park one afternoon for a rally. It might seem like a typically American scene, a small parade in the town square, people carrying brightly colored banners, statues resplendent in the bright autumn air. Only this was a protest march against homosexuals. People waved their Bibles and they shouted that homosexuals were evil and unnatural according to God's holy words. Reading about that event made me uneasy too. It wasn't my idea of Americana. I found myself thinking, thank God we have a constitution and separation of church and state. In any case, the fundamentalist activity at the fair and the rally turned my mind toward public and even national events as they were related to religion and psychic activity, and I could feel myself trying to make certain important connections that had so far escaped me. At the same time, something else made me consider the public or sociological implications of trance material, my own in particular. Sue Watkins, a close friend and former student, had been writing a book, Conversations with Seth, about her experiences in my classes. Actually, the book was to be almost a biography of the class itself and would feature many previously unpublished Seth sessions. I was reading Sue's manuscript for the first time, the same weekend that the psychic fair was being held, so that the two events became related in my mind. At first, it was strange and even a bit unsettling to read about the class, Seth, and myself, as seen from someone else's viewpoint. Perhaps that jogged me into looking at my experiences from a slightly different perspective, too. And before I realized, I was thinking about the state of the nation again, when the Seth sessions started. It seemed certain that some interaction between public affairs and the events of my own private life must have caused a peculiar kind of tension that generated my psychic initiation. That peculiar tension must happen only when certain types of persons encounter particular kinds of historical events, I thought. Again, I remembered my concerns back in late 1963. John F. Kennedy had just been assassinated. There had been talk about a big showdown with Cuba. Rob and I had stocked survival food, a rifle, and other supplies in the closet. Those national events made a deep impression on our private lives, and surely the Seth sessions provided a new framework or platform from which we could consider what was going on in our lives and in the world. Looking at that perspective, my private trances were originally triggered, at least partially, by national need, and were a response to the problems of the times, as they infringed upon my private life. In a fashion, then, I had been responding to the needs of others as well as myself, in that strange shamanistic tradition of which I had been unaware. It was quite possible then, I thought, that when the problems of the species became too great for its framework of understanding, a new psychological acceleration began in response to the tension until one way or another we broke free to a larger extent. And surely now was the time. We'd become exteriorized to an alarming degree, I mused, acting as if we were indeed science's living machines, manufactured by some automatic, brilliant mechanics that ran itself without reason, mindless survival machines. Or we acted as if we were a God's sinful creatures, tainted with evil since birth. Our thoughts became so identified with exterior organizations that we'd invested themselves with parts of ourselves, then lost sight of those portions. We stopped asking the important questions for ourselves. Instead, we turned over the questions to science or religion, and we largely accepted their prepackaged answers and explanations. The orange leaves spun in dizzying patterns outside the window day after day, and I'd stare at them thinking, is it possible that we are only thinking machines? Our thoughts, the automatic byproducts of the brain's processes. Could these thoughts be just psychological shapes, flickering in the fire of consumed energy, as meaningless in themselves as the fantasy shapes that flames make in a fireplace? That was what science would have us believe. But that framework was too narrow to contain our experience. It was too narrow and limited to offer any real solutions to the problems of the world. So no wonder, I thought, there were psychic fairs and village malls. No wonder historic heroes, wise men, spacemen, and saints were all communicating through automatic writing or Ouija boards. No wonder there were new cults springing up everywhere. And no wonder that the prophets of doom were taking over the television screens and the ancient religions were trying a new revival. The psychological acceleration had begun. The mass psyche was pushing at its boundaries, reaching, searching, using all of its energy to pull free. The old dogmas might blaze with new fire for a moment, but the people were busy in their own ways. They were again ready to approach the universe and their experience directly. What did it all mean, I wondered, and what were they? What were we really up to? We were rediscovering our ancient tools of God-making, I thought, polishing those psychological skills that had grown rusty from disuse through the many centuries. We were ready to come out from behind our dogmas and ceremonies, to encounter the universe through our own lives, and to try once again to push against our recognized boundaries. We might make errors again. We might even drag along dark vestiges from the past, gods and devils, martyrs, evil spirits, and divine curses. But we were on the move again, and maybe one day we would shake off that pesky pack of superstitions. The phrase God-making still struck me as perfectly apt and strange at the same time. I felt the same way about this emphasis on religion. One day, that fall, I wrote the following notes, trying to organize my thoughts on the subject. As I did, the leaves outside were falling everywhere, and by the time I finished writing, one whole portion of the clear sky was exposed that before had been filled with still clinging foliage. The sky seemed almost severe. Glad to be rid of the clutter of leaves, exposed and somehow closer to earth. So I imagined the mass psyche shaking off ancient beliefs, impatient to be free of them. And my notes read, quote, I think that religions originate in our own creative abilities, which are more powerful than we suspect. As I wrote a short time ago, and that the birth of any great religion represents those creative energies wedded to psychic events, as man seeks to dramatize and express the vast scope of his own subjective reality, and looks for the source of being with a capital B. The result is a trans-dimensional spectacular event, an exalted vision superimposed upon historical fact. We often forget that there are different kinds of reality and that our experience of any one of them is dependent upon our perception. The events of the psyche are quite real in quotes, and have their effect on usual experience, whether or not they happen historically. For example, whatever physical events actually were involved in the birth of Christianity became characters of supercharged psychic vision, bringing about a union of psychic creativity and historical fact. Physical events became the medium with which the mass psyche works at such times. Instead of using paint or stone, the psyche sculpts the facts of history into a living psychodrama. In this process, all actions become supercharged, super intense. Hallucinated events are allowed to supersede physical ones and cast their light over time's landscape. Cast their light over time's landscape. The birth of a religion, then, involves a peculiar blending of psychic and historical events. And when that process is over, man is left with a hybrid dramatization that he apparently takes literally, following the form rather than the spirit of the originating revelatory material. This happens, I think, whenever we try to translate psychic data into absolute terms. And we make that error because we've not yet learned to distinguish the gradations of reality. Science deals with a predictable world in which the events of the psyche have no meaning. My first startling out-of-body experience, then it says in brackets, see the Seth material, my first startling out-of-body experience would be considered as hallucination by science, yet it initiated my psychic adventures and is certainly responsible in part for the Seth sessions and all of the books published as a result. What I'm trying to say is that the mind forms matter, but usually this process is psychologically invisible. When religions are born, the balance tips in favor of the mind, and the non-physical events are always behind physical ones that begin to show. But we mistake the psychic's product source. We think it comes from outside of ourselves. We objectify the events into a stream of historic fact. We ignore the process, the state of consciousness in which all this happens, and it's the process itself that is so important. At such times, the mass psyche opens up, sensing a greater psychological reality, and in an action we never quite glimpse, its energy goes splashing out, striking the world of historic events, making this individual or that one, marking this individual or that one with an imprint of magnetic significance. End quote. As it was happening again, I thought, as I read my notes. And it was happening again, I thought, as I read my notes. Even science was a religion of sorts, involved in a search for man's origins. Only how odd was it that such an orderly discipline could accept random chance and natural selection as explanations for a complicated, orderly universe. And when you really thought of it, how strange that religion itself, in its long history, couldn't come up with any better explanations than its curious assortment of unbelievable gods, underworlds, and heavens. I felt as if I had some excellent insights, but was missing an important point that would pull all my ideas together. To clear my mind, I began an acrylic painting of the maple tree in front of the yard. I finished reading Sue's manuscript, astonished again by the various interpretations that different individuals would place on a seemingly single event. Sue's book was fascinating and very well written. Finally, I forgot God-making and its implications for a while. When I was finished my painting and Sue's manuscript, though, my questions were still waiting, with a new one added. Seth had been dictating his dreams, evolution, and value fulfillment in our regular sessions, delivering material that Rob and I thought offered a brilliant alternative explanation of the origin of the universe, and described a new vision of man and nature that was far superior to the dogmatic answers of science or religion. But in man's long history, why hadn't he, or why hadn't we, developed such a philosophy centuries ago and built our civilizations around it? Why had we ended up instead with people like Reverend Grover shouting about hell and damnation on modern television screens, or with supposedly well-meaning men and women holding anti-homosexual rallies in city parks, all in the name of God, or with a science that had no reverence for life. And what significant ambiguity did I sense in all this that I couldn't quite mentally locate? The answer came in a way that was both commonplace and surprising. Actually, it was an unexpected visit from 3 lively young people that finally drew my ideas together into clear focus and set me down smack in the middle of a philosophical place where I'd never really been before. The 3 strangers came on one of those exciting days in late autumn when the air is crisp and shiny, and the wind high in the near empty treetops, and the shadows moving everywhere. I just reached a stopping point in my writing when I heard the sounds of laughter coming from the back porch. This time I felt like seeing company. So apparently did Rob. Hearing the voices, he came to answer the door, and the 3 young people trooped in, full of health, vitality, eyes alert, not missing anything. I was in the small breezeway studio, so everyone crowded in there. Rob felt like taking a break from his work too, so he poured us all glasses of wine and he sat himself down. I'll call our visitors Charles, Anna, and Sarah. They said breathlessly that they couldn't believe that I was actually seeing them, drinking wine with them. Rob and I started laughing at their enthusiasm. Finally, we all ended up laughing and joking. Charles did most of the talking. To me, he resembled pictures of the poet as a young man that I'd seen in an old anthology. His body seemed to fall into natural poses, and when he stopped smiling, a kind of self-conscious soberness gave his features a dramatic cast. Anna and Sarah were beautiful young women, both out to show that they had brains as well as beauty, and all of them had a kind of European formality that showed now and then, usually when it seemed to temper their impulsiveness. After their initial burst of enthusiasm and display of high spirits, for example, all 3 suddenly quieted, as if afraid that they'd gone too far, or thought they might be reprimanded. You could see them compose themselves. Anna and Sarah lowered their bright eyes and smoothed out the few wrinkles in their blue jeans over their knees. Charles sipped his wine in an almost formal fashion. In a few minutes, we discovered the reason for their reactions. Charles told us they had just returned to the States from Europe, where all 3 had attended a particular school specializing in the expansion of consciousness. Even though the arts were specifically featured, the entire structure of the courses had been highly authoritative. They offered us each a scholarship so that we'd be able to teach there ourselves when we were finished, Charles said. But after a while, the atmosphere was really smothering. So we thanked them, and we'd come back home, at least for a while. Still, Europe has that ancient culture, Sarah said nostalgically. I mean, those cathedrals and castles dating back through the centuries. But it did get stifling, and even the teaching of art in the school followed the founder's philosophy. And right there, something happened, as if this visit from the 3 young people home from abroad and the discussion of European culture were just the precise data needed to release the insights that I'd been looking for from that invisible psychological computer to which I sensed we're all connected. I could actually feel certain ideas being moved around in my mind, rearranged, as if an entirely new sorting out process were occurring to make room for the newer information. And that information came with a strong emotional surge. I started talking so quickly and spontaneously that my words startled me, so that I had to hear them like everyone else before I knew what I was saying. "That's it," I said, and to me, my words sounded wondrously clear. Europe is a place of ancient beliefs and authoritative doctrines. Now, it just occurred to me that it's no coincidence that I started my own work here in this country. When our country was founded, it was a land for the do-it-yourselfers. Modern spiritualism started here too, but it didn't go far enough. Christianity itself came here from Europe, and we should have left it behind too, but we didn't. The new country needed a religion uniquely suited to a democracy. Perhaps religion isn't the proper word. A vision, an authoritative, absolute God, doesn't fit a democracy any more than an absolute king or dictator would. My own words startled me. The idea was completely new to me on a conscious level, but it was so obvious once it was spoken that it was inconceivable that I hadn't thought of it before. An absolute God whose word was to be obeyed without question didn't belong in a democracy. Luckily, the Constitution did provide for a separation of church and state, but behind that was the implied belief that the Christian God stood invisibly behind our presidents, and when our presidents sent the people off to war, it was in God's name as well as in the name of the country. I was making so many connections that I couldn't wait to write everything down, and I was even somewhat dazed by what certainly seemed to be a uniquely American vision, since I'd never been particularly patriotic. But I sensed suddenly the national roots of my work, and I felt them reach back to the country's beginnings. Even then, we were determined to free our minds from the past. We just hadn't gone far enough. I can't remember exactly how I ended the conversation with our guests, but after they left, I found myself thinking of the school that they described and of many other such establishments devoted to esoteric knowledge. They were all authoritative in nature, given to disciplinarian activities, stressing European rather than American traditions, while others followed Buddhistic principles, emphasizing not individuality, but selflessness. Early American spiritualism did make an attempt to break away, though, I thought. It represented an attempt to tackle the questions of immortality with a unique do-it-yourself zest tied to the American literal-mindedness. If the dead really survived, well, let them talk for themselves. Let them produce good evidence. Anything physical would do. Raps, voices, ectoplasm that could be seen or almost seen. Let's bring the entire question into the democratic light of day, where even the scientists can get a good look. That had been the attitude, but unfortunately, spiritualism carried along with it all of the good and evil spirits of religion and superstition. Good doses of chicanery were also involved, as the well-intended tried to manufacture the evidence for survival that seemed so elusive. Besides all this, a touch of exotica was added as spiritualists deserted Native American guides for Tibetan masters, monks, and assorted gurus. But now, maybe television would do a real service, I thought, remembering the Reverend Grover, seeing the various evangelists on televised spectaculars, people might finally make certain comparisons between such programs and other TV fare. They might understand at last that the Bible is a far bloodier and violent drama than they'd realized. So the more I thought about it, the more I approved of such exposure in the public forum. I also remembered several American writers from the past that I wished were represented there too. I thought of Walt Whitman, Thoreau, and Emerson. They were peculiarly American as thinkers, with their stress upon individuality, mysticism, strength, expression, and responsibility. Darwin and Freud were both European, their theories tinged by ancient prejudices and pessimisms. But mostly I remembered my own conflicts. For years I felt caught between the philosophies of T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings as expressed in their poetry. Once I almost knew Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, by heart, and would read it aloud at a moment's notice. I thought that it represented a devastating but true picture of reality. In contrast, there was E.E. Cummings, and I knew his poem, My Father Moved Through Dooms of Love, by heart also. Eliot's pessimism pervaded the arts and sciences, and it became fashionable to be bored with life. No one really paid much attention to E.E. Cummings. His optimism went out of style. He was called simplistic for caring. It hadn't occurred to me before, in just the same way that Eliot was so buried in European tradition. For although born and educated in America, he became a British subject. I just never thought much about it, but E.E. Cummings had a vision of America, and no one listened. His vision was swallowed by Darwinism and Freudianism, and so was Whitman's, and Thoreau's, and Emerson's. I felt a certain sorrow for those now rather unfashionable American writers, and it was during this period that I wrote the poem E.E. Cummings' Ghost that appeared in the front matter of this book. At the same time, I saw that my impulses had led me truly from the God of Jane idea through to my psychic manifesto, to the realization that what we all needed was a decentralized God, and I knew that my work for this particular book was finished. Overall, then, I envisioned us as being part of an indivisible Godhead or source to which we each give individual expression through the actions of our lives, but for which no one person or group or dogma or book can presume to speak in absolute terms. This divinity or ultimate reality endows us with inner direction that's provided, as Seth says, through our natural impulses. Those impulses are uniquely suited to bring about our own individual fulfillments and accomplishments in a way that also benefits all life. This stress on impulses in no way denies the importance of the intellect, however. As a species, we are impulsively intellectual. We have the impulse to reason. We will indeed have quite different visions and versions of God. All that is, ultimate reality, or whatever other term we may use to describe our unknown source, as we each interpret reality through our own unique experiences and abilities. Such diversity should be taken for granted, but we should allow no one such vision to be accepted as absolute or carrying the indelible stamp of divine approval, since we are apparently natural God makers, it's about time that we begin to examine the psychic and psychological processes involved. Ultimately, we form our entire civilizations around such beliefs. Obviously, then, the processes themselves arouse the deepest levels of the psyche. The events of any religion become supercharged. The heady mixture of psychic and historic events fuses, and henceforth cannot be separated. I think that the preliminary stages of such new explosive psychic rebirth are upon us now. People are looking for alternative explanations of reality. Growing numbers of them can see little sense either in Christianity's or science's version of the nature of man and his place in nature's framework. Again, an authoritative, absolute God doesn't fit a democracy any more than a king or dictator would. How is it that we haven't realized that before? True, our president must at least check with Congress before sending our people off to war, but the president's authority has always been backed up by the certainty that God was on our side, and based on the assumption that wars, mass murders, were justified if committed in the combined service of God and country. So, no more. The next time it's shouted from national podiums that God is on our side, we have the right to ask, which God? Jesus? The God who said, "Blessed are the meek," or the Jesus who cursed the fig tree? The God of the religious fundamentalists? Of the Jews? Which God? The gods of Jane and Rob and the gods of my readers are apt to be a bit more loving, certainly less terrible and less sure of themselves. Their messages are for private persons, and I'm convinced that in those terms we do have individual gods, that the portion of the universe that formed us continues to do so, and that the universe and the selves that we meet and intersect at, those psychic levels where our creativity begins. But we've been taught the opposite. We've been taught that as a species we're cursed from antiquity, flawed by original sin or by science's selfish genes. No wonder we couldn't trust ourselves and our lives. No wonder we had such difficulties worldwide for as far back as history is recorded. Maybe the time is ripe for a change. We need a democracy of spirit to end to divine hierarchies. And this country may well be the most auspicious place for such a rebirth. If Christianity's authoritative God clashes with democratic ideals, the idea of a divinity expressing itself equally through each citizen fits in quite well. In fact, that divine quality in man would provide the self-reliance and trust that would truly enable a people to govern themselves. Such a people would never give war a divine sanction, but would consider it a deplorable example of man's own distorted beliefs about himself and the world, beliefs that do indeed pit one nation against another. And such a people would no longer hook up the idea of individualism with Darwinian survival of the fittest doctrines that foster competition rather than cooperation. I'm going to read that sentence again. And such a people would no longer hook up the idea of individualism with Darwinian survival of the fittest doctrines that foster competition rather than cooperation. There is no doubt that we need to believe that life has meaning. That belief may well be a biological imperative. If we were, as science maintains, only creatures formed by elements combining mindlessly in a universe that itself created by chance, surrounded everywhere by chaos, then how could we even conceive of the idea of meaning or order? Science would say that the idea of meaning itself is simply a reflection of the state of the brain, as is the illusion of our consciousness. But a science that disregards consciousness must necessarily end up creating its own illusion. It ignores the reality of experience, the evidence of being, and in so doing, it denies rather than reinforces life's values. We need a division of scientific dogma from national policy making so that those values not considered by science can be given some voice in issues involving public welfare. An authoritative God coupled with an aggressive science sanctioned by national policy could have disastrous results indeed. The universal divinity or ultimate reality or all that is wouldn't be confined to one people or nation or species, though, but it would include all species of life. Each creature, each life, whatever its degree, would have its rights as an expression of that source and as an inhabitant of Earth and contributor to planetary existence. Divinity then would be dispersed throughout creation. I become more and more convinced that the mass psyche is preparing for another intuitive upthrust, and that within its vast ranges it does possess the solutions, visions, and wisdom that we need. That power is making itself felt in the private arena. It's expressed and personified in the psychic experience of large numbers of people. It speaks through the spacemen and saints and psychic heroes of automatic writings and Ouija board messages, even in the cults and the frenzied activities of the fundamentalists. The mass psyche is looking for a way out of official beliefs. It's ready to form a more comprehensive vision. But we must stop automatically taking such information at face value, translating it automatically through ancient beliefs. We must look directly at our own experience again and learn to trust it. We must be our own psychic naturalists, combining reason with intuition. We must refuse to let old theories define our realities for us, limiting and distorting the very scope of our lives. Instead, we must learn to acknowledge and interpret our own psychic perceptions. Okay, let me start that sentence again. Instead, we must learn to acknowledge and interpret our own psychic perceptions, to distinguish between, say, psychic newscasts, documentaries, dramas, fantasies, and educational programs. We have to learn to read the language of the psyche and to discover far more about the psychodrama's strange blend of inner and exterior events. And to do all that, we have to trust ourselves and our impulses. In order to be sane and healthy, in order to even begin to understand our potentials as a species, we have to cultivate ideas and philosophies that provide us with a secure psychological base as good creatures alive in a good universe. Otherwise, by our own definitions, we condemn ourselves as meaningless, subjective mechanisms, or as the sinful children of an ancient, revengeful God. And as Seth states in his Individual and the Nature of Mass Events, we must redefine our ideas of good and evil and re-examine the characteristics of idealism so that we really understand that the end cannot justify the means taken to achieve it. Our ideals must be reflected in the methods we use to fulfill them. These are all issues in which each of us can be personally involved by studying them as they appear in our personal lives. It's vitally important that we examine and explore the reaches of our own consciousnesses, gather evidence of those unofficial psychic events held in such disgrace by science and religion, and build up our own confidence. We need to examine the very contents and processes of our minds, not with instruments, but with our consciousness itself. As I type this final chapter, Rob has just finished his work on Seth's The Individual and Nature of Mass Events, and Seth is already on Chapter 9 of Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment. I've clocked many more hours of trance time, of course, and I'm still trying to map those contours of the psyche in which my subjective travels happen. There is a point, though, where the private psyche opens up to the mass psyche, and where they both become aware of a still greater source from which all reality emerges. The completed manuscript for mass events sits on Rob's desk right now, and even if we can't prove Seth's model of reality any more than sciences or religions, certainly Seth provides a more intellectually and emotionally satisfying one, as far as I'm concerned, and one that leaves us room for gallant, meaningful action. And how strange that my private impulses led me to a kind of public vision in which we all uphold a democracy of spirit and insist upon interpreting not just the Bible, but the nature of reality for ourselves. And this concludes The God of Jane. What a wonderful book. Wow. And I'm going to look for that poem that she referred to at the beginning of this book and read it to you next. Here's the poem that Jane referred to. It's called E. E. Cummings' Ghost. E. E. Cummings' ghost, slippery as polished smoke, slipped through time's keyhole. His thoughts, like silver rain, seeped out of his brain and found themselves alive and growing in a place where all matter is mind. Now he rides the backs of the bronco molecules and, like microscopic cowboy, lassoes his dreams with a silver cord. And he shouts, Yahoo! God bless America! Having at last found his innocent beginning land. He is the rollicking pioneer of a brand new planet, with endless mind prairies roamed by great thought cattle, the very first settler of lands that form themselves into the shapes of his desire. His feelings roll out into new miniatures, infinities, receding into worlds that open up as the silver smoke of thought turns solid, as you can see if you even peek through time's keyhole. And I'm going to leave this poem in the show notes below so you can read it for yourself, because I know poetry needs to be read to yourself. And I hope you enjoyed this book. Now, right now I'm reading Mass Events, and I'm also going to read Dreams and Evolution and Fulfillment, or whatever it was. That's going to be the next book that I tackle. So if you're into it, till soon.